There's been no indication that the Russians are really, actually, in fact, interested in a peace agreement with Ukraine. They want we all know this. We all know what President Putin has said, what he really wants. He wants to dominate. He wants to eliminate Ukraine. So he doesn't want to negotiate or compromise with the Ukrainians or the Americans over Ukraine, for that matter. So no, I don't think the Russians are serious about this whole process.
Ambassador Taylor, and does it worry you that Europe is somehow almost absent from this process? Not almost, but, partially, nearly, push to the sidelines?
They have been, but they have reasserted themselves several times, Nataliia. Several times the Ukrainians have invited the Europeans in, and the Europeans have made phone calls and have shown up in Washington, in the White House, with President Zelensky, to support President Zelensky. And then over just the past couple of days, the President Trump and the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany have gotten on the phone, and the Europeans have asserted themselves, have reminded President Trump that a lot depends on the Europeans in this agreement. The security guarantees that are so important for Ukraine, and only if Ukraine gets solid security guarantees will the Ukrainians be willing to sign this agreement, as I understand it. So that's up to the Europeans to provide most of the security guarantee. The Europeans, of course, want some support from the Americans on that security guarantee, and that will come as well. But the Europeans are really a major part of the security guarantee that is a crucial part of this plan. The second thing, Nataliia, is the frozen assets. As we all know, most of the frozen Russian assets are in European banks. Most of them are in Belgium. Most of them are in Euroclear. So the Europeans need to get those assets in a way that either a loan or some other way to Ukraine to enable Ukrainians to be financially solid for the next 2 or 3 years with that $300 billion worth of Russian frozen assets. And the Ukrainians know, the Americans know, that the Europeans are key to the frozen assets. So for both of those reasons, the Europeans have to be involved. President Trump understands that. That's why he got on the phone to them over the past 2 days.
And from what I've heard from my sources, the next week will be very pivotal moment for Ukraine regarding those 300,000 Russian frozen assets, because there will be a summit in Brussels, EU summit, and they will decide, though. Some decision will come from that meeting. And also, do you see a risk that Washington's desire for profitable business deals with Russia could ultimately steer the negotiations into a direction that is dangerous for Ukraine?
No. I think that the possibility of business deals will come after this war ends. This will come after the Russians agree to a peace deal with the Ukrainians and the Americans. It's only after the Russians stop the war that there can be really any interesting talk about commercial deals, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in Ukraine, wherever. It cannot happen while the Russians continue to bombard Ukraine. And so after the war ends, after the Russians realize that they can't win, Putin realizes that he can't win, and he stops the war, then fine. There can be some business deals. I'll be surprised, frankly, to tell you, I'll be surprised if American firms are going to be very interested in investing in Russia. Would you invest in Russia? I wouldn't invest in Russia, knowing what they do, knowing how they're governed, knowing what they have done to Ukraine, knowing what they have done to their own businesses, their own opposition. Yeah, would you? No one in their right mind is going to be investing in Russia. But that's not even an interesting, relevant question until after this war ends.
Yes. And also some Western politicians argue that sanctions against Russia have only made Putin more furious and more violent, but not weaker. In your view, do sanctions still remain the most effective tool against the Kremlin in 2025?
No, not the most effective. The most effective tool are Ukrainian armed forces reinforced by Europeans and American armed forces. That's the most effective tool. After that, sanctions can help. Sanctions have already had an effect on the Russian economy. The sanctions on the Russian oil sector have already reduced the flow of revenues that the Russians get from selling oil and gas, exporting oil and gas. Has reduced that flow by 20, 30% by some estimates. And that means that the Russian economy and the Russian treasury is being starved of those revenues. That means that the Russians will have a harder and harder time prosecuting this war. They don't have the money to continue to do this war. So yeah, the sanctions are having an effect, not decisive effect, not decisive yet, but the flow of funds into the Russian economy and treasury and into the war machine is having a cumulative effect on Putin's ability to run this war. So first, our weapons and success on the battlefield. And then second would be the sanctions. Third, again, I come back to these $300 billion of Russian frozen central bank assets that are going to be really important for Ukraine, and also a strong message to Putin that he cannot win.
And since this summer, we got through a very turbulent period. I mean, we in Ukraine. How does Washington view Ukraine's internal challenges as the country continues to fight, adapt, and stay resilient under extreme pressure, but having its own internal problems?
So I was just there last week, and I've been there 12 times since the big war started, and I've seen all of these issues. We've also heard President Trump talk about the bravery, just in the past week, the bravery of Ukrainians and the resilience. So the Americans recognize that all nations have internal politics and internal political problems. Everybody recognizes that all nations have their own corruption problems. Ukraine, yes, has its own corruption problem. It knows it. It has established NABU and SAPO and the High Anti-Corruption Court. There was a threat to the independence of NABU and SAPO this summer, which was then turned around. NABU and SAPO have used that independence, that reaffirmed independence, to go after a big scam in the energy field, in Energoatom. And that's what NABU and SAPO are supposed to do. That's what they found out. They found out there's a big problem there, which President Zelensky, as I understand it, is encouraging and supporting that investigation. He's fired a couple of ministers. Andriy Yermak is no longer the head of the administration, head of the president's office. And the top priority for the Americans and the Europeans and Ukrainians is to win the war. And yes, they have to deal with corruption. We've all had to deal with corruption over the years, and that will continue. But what's most important right now is to win this war, is to stop the Russians, is to prevail against the Russians and end their aggression against Ukraine.